Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Doug Irwin. I'm a co-director of the Political Economy Project and an economics professor here at Dartmouth. Before we get started, I just want to remind you about, or inform you about, an event next Thursday in this room at 5 p.m. That's October 16th. We'll have Professor Benjamin Friedman from Harvard University speaking on the moral consequences of economic growth. So that's for Professor Clark's class, but it should be of broad interest, I think, to students and faculty alike. The question we're going to consider this afternoon is whether we need an abundance agenda and how we would characterize that. The question is, have we become a bloated society where it's very difficult to build things, it's very difficult for people to move between regions, very difficult to innovate, and whether this sclerosis, in some senses, led to national malaise that embeds populism, both on the left and the right. You might have heard of the recent book on the abundance agenda by, whoops, and we're losing our lights.
Yeah, that was a little too romantic there. That was, yeah.
By Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. I know Rocky is trying to work to bring Ezra Klein to campus next spring, and this is something that's going to be on the political agenda on both sides of the political aisle. We have a perfect person to speak about these issues, Steve Teles, who's a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. He's been a friend to Dartmouth and come here earlier to talk about his earlier book, The Captured Economy. He also has a book on the rise of the conservative legal movement, many other books and papers. You should check out his website. He's associated with the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., a very important think tank, and he has sort of innovated the catchphrase "kludge" to discuss how bureaucracies impede progress and slow things down, both in the private sector as well as the public sector. So he's going to speak on the abundance agenda for about half an hour or so. If you are a student and you have to leave at some point, we certainly understand. We just appreciate your being here. Don't feel obligated to stay for the whole time if you do have another appointment, but otherwise...
We will embarrass you on the way out.
Okay, but otherwise I'll turn it over to Steve to talk about this important issue. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. So I would like to make one request, which may seem unorthodox. I would like you to close your devices, just so we can have an hour, just us, hanging out, talking about ideas, not texting our parents, being like, "Oh my God, I'm in the worst lecture." Like we don't need that. Also, I want to thank Doug, obviously, for bringing me up. It's very generous. Partially just so I could see my wonderful niece, Harper, who's starting here, and my all-time favorite student, Molly, who's a pre-doc here. So I'm going to talk about abundance, which is, I'm not actually talking about ice cream, which would be awesome. That would be even better, just to talk about ice cream, because everybody likes ice cream and not everybody likes abundance. But I've been around a lot of the ideas, and again, like any idea, right? This has many cooks, right, who brought it together, right? It's not just one super genius who had an idea, right? I like to think of the people who are around this idea as what some people have called sort of a thought collective, right? It's people who are like talking to each other, we're arguing with each other, we're building something, we're also building organization while we're thinking about building organization, and we're thinking about, we're doing all that kind of together. So we're standing up student chapters. So if anybody actually wants to start student chapter on abundance at Dartmouth, I'd be happy to help you do that. We're creating all kinds of other infrastructure at the same time as we're trying to figure out what the thing is, right? And so that's a really complicated problem. And a lot of the point of this talk is going to be that this is a weird kind of idea. It's not the kind of idea we're used to creating in a modern American society. And it's not the kind of organizational network that we're used to creating, right? In some ways, this is a very countercultural thing to do in an era of polarization. And so some of you may have heard of Ezra and Derek's book. This is another weird one that I knew Ezra when he was, as they say, just a boy chick, and when he was just starting in American Prospect. And so in some ways, I think I've had a kind of role in his development, and then he's written things that have influenced me. But one thing that's important is I should give you the little bit of the background. So this was originally a talk I gave at this big abundance conference we had in DC. We had 500 people. It was supposed to be a little bit of a coming out exercise for this larger movement to sort of introduce people to it. And one thing I was trying to introduce them to is that Ezra and Derek's book, as great as it is only one part of the larger movement that we're building, right? So who here has actually read the book? Has anybody read Abundance? Right.
Does skimming it count?
Huh? No. You either read it or you didn't. This is a bimodal variable. So one of the things I was trying to do in the book is to say this larger movement, this larger collection of people running organizations, actually doing things, and one of the things I want to emphasize is a lot of the people doing abundance are not thinkers, right? Or they're people who are like, intelligent practitioners. They're people who are making abundance. So I've met one of my favorite things is we're going to get in a second to a category that I call Cascadian abundance, and which was in this paper that I wrote. And this incredible woman who lives outside of Seattle emailed me back and said, "Oh my God, for the first time I feel seen." And I was like, "Oh, what do you mean?" She's like, "Well, I just had no political category to put myself into. I didn't just feel like a regular lefty or an environmentalist or whatever, right? And that really made my practice make sense to me, right? I know how to organize people around because now I have like an intellectual category that makes what I'm trying to do make sense to me, right?" But there's a bunch of these, and that's the whole point of the varieties, is that, and first of all, abundance is different in that it's not just something on the standard left-right dimension, right? This is the way we're used to thinking about politics, and people can kind of place themselves along this, and they're like, well, I'm a centrist, or I'm actually conservative, or I'm MAGA, or whatever, right? But part of what abundance is trying to do is to say that left-right dimension came into existence to explain a certain kind of set of issues, right? So in particular, those are about size of government, right? Should it be big or should it be small, right? The regulation of the private sector. Should we have a lot of regulation? Should we have a little regulation? And we're used to, when you add enough of those up, right, that's what the left-right dimension is, right? And it was really designed for a particular period of time in which that was the central dimension in politics. Everybody in abundance, right, thinks that at a minimum, there's some second dimension. There's some second dimension that's as important as that first dimension, which is really about all of the problems with getting anything done, either in the public or the private sector, right? And we're going to come back here, and I'm going to, I just don't want people to think that I'm exactly a carbon copy of Doug Irwin. As great as Doug Irwin is, so I'm going to throw some shade at Doug Irwin at some point in this talk, just to show that I'm not that he's. I'm just going to show that Doug is a heterodox, pluralistic guy who invites people who don't agree with him on everything. Okay, so one thing I want to say is that abundance. So abundance is about a second dimension, right? A second dimension that's about the challenges of getting things done, which partially is about deregulation, but it's just as much about deregulation of the public sector as it is deregulation of the private sector, right? So the old left-right dimension was about regulation of the private sector. A lot of abundance is about regulation of the public sector, which I'll explain in a second. Second thing is abundance is syncretic, right? It's an idea that mostly doesn't create in some entirely new ideological category. I think of it as coming in and improving a wide range of ideological projects across a wide range. And this will make sense when I start getting into that, right? It doesn't erase all these previous ideologies, but it blends with them and creates new kinds of syntheses, right? And if abundance succeeds, if this project I'm going to describe succeeds, it's going to succeed by being everywhere, right? It's going to insinuate itself into a bunch of different projects across the standard left-right dimension, right? So in short, abundance is both one thing and many, just like these ice creams. Okay, so what makes abundance abundance? This is the worst graphic we have, by the way. The graphics get better from here. So simply put, so somebody was like, I have no idea what abundance is. So this is my simple thing to explain what abundance is. So the top here abundance expresses a kind of aspiration to get around the problems that are created by scarcity, right? Now, so again, Doug, being a good economist, would tell me that there's always scarcity, right? But economics is not just about the efficient allocation of scarce goods, right? It's about the creation of more, right? Especially the creation of positive sum kind of interactions. We're not just talking about redistributing a particular good, right? So we want to, in general, people who care about abundance care about supply, right? Fundamentally, right, they want to figure out how to get more of things that matter to us rather than trying to solve problems by subsidizing a scarce set of primary goods, right? And so basically, I read in a paper a few years ago called Cost Disease Socialism with Sam Hammond and Daniel Takish, and the fundamental argument of this, again, nothing that you would have to go past the second day of your micro class to get, right, is that if you have goods whose supply is constrained, right, and then people can't afford them, and you try and solve the problem of people not being able to afford them by subsidizing the purchase of that scarce good, the price only can go up, right? There's only one way for that additional subsidy to reappear, and it reappears in price. So you imagine if there's not enough houses, right? Because we have zoning restrictions or other kind of things, and therefore the price of the housing goes up, and then people can't afford houses, and you say, we're gonna try and solve that problem by giving them a subsidy to help them buy the house, right? If you can't have more houses come out of that, all that happens is the price goes up, right? And that problem reappears over and over and over again, right? Whether it's healthcare, in some ways, that's what we've been trying to do with healthcare, right? Is that we have a largely fixed supply of doctors, of other kinds of innovations, and so we keep trying to help people pay for health insurance, and then magically the price of healthcare keeps going up, right? Well, that's more or less what, again, probably the second day of micro would have told you. So our instinct is to solve problems by unlocking supply, right? And that turns out to be that's a very simple insight that leads you into a bunch of complex problems, right? But we basically think that everything needs to be cheaper, right? So many of our basic social problems are a result of some of the basic goods that are necessary for a decent life being increasingly expensive. And they need to be not just cheaper, but they need to be faster. Right? We need to make cycles of innovation much faster. We need housing to appear much faster, right? The problem with housing isn't just that it's too expensive, but it takes too long. The same thing is true for lots of other goods. Public transit is the same thing, right? Is anybody who here grew up in a city? You grew up next to a train line, though, so that almost counts, right? The time it takes for the United States to build anything, right, where public transit is concerned, is nearly comical if it wasn't so tragic. So we've been working on a project called the Purple Line right by where I live, which is basically just a streetcar, right? That's a technology that we invented in the 1800s, right? We had streetcars. And it turns out that has taken multiple decades in DC to build a streetcar across Montgomery County. Okay, so that's abundance. Abundance is, first of all, saying if we had more, we would have fewer basically distributive conflicts. It would be easier to solve problems in a way that was positive sum, where everyone could be made better off. But there's a reason why we don't have that, right? It's not a mystery why supply is all clogged up in many of these areas. And those are the two sides of this, right? One is that we have rent-seeking coalitions. So I wrote a previous book called The Captured Economy, which the last time I was graced with the invitation of Dartmouth to come and talk, I talked about. And what that basically describes is that we have over and over in our economy, we have various different kinds of rent-seeking coalitions that have an interest in keeping supply down, right? So the most obvious one is housing, right? There's a kind of, again, this is a very Dartmouth thing to talk about, this sort of housing cartel, famous ideas that came out of Dartmouth's economic department, right? that while most people would be better off if we had easy ability to build when prices go up, people who own houses have a very different interest, right? They want housing to be scarce, right? And so there's a great book by a bunch of BU political scientists called Neighborhood Defenders that describes that kind of politics, right? Where again, the price, and again, you got to spend all day long just fighting against the price signal, right? But that's what a bunch of people do in very high-priced neighborhoods, is keep people from, converting their house into apartment buildings or quads or building ADUs in their backyard that would sort of alleviate supply. So the first answer to getting more supply for all the varieties I'm going to talk about is some form of organizing the disorganized public, right? So, and this is where, I don't know, how many people here have ever read Mansur Olson? Oh my God, wait, okay, so that's better than normal. Some of you are professors, that doesn't quite count. They're all professors, right? So Mansur Olson famously said that the basic sort of problem in democracy was that it's much easier to organize concentrated interests than diffuse ones, right? And that over and over again, over time, that's going to lead to the calcification of the economy as you get more of these distributive coalitions that create barriers to entry and limit growth, but end up reinforcing the economic power of those who already have things. One thing that almost everybody in abundance believes is that that is not a natural law. And we learned that essentially from the YIMBY activists, the people who are the Yes in My Backyard, the people who are organizing, starting in California, now other places, is it actually turns out you can organize people around diffuse interest. These people are doing it. They're showing up at city council meetings and planning meetings and actually yelling at people that they need to build more housing. Right? So one, I think abundance people have actually discovered that maybe it is possible to solve the collective action problem. Maybe you actually can organize people, or you can at least organize them enough to change the rules to move where decisions are made away from where these rent-seeking coalitions are strongest. So the first thing, again, that is in all of the abundance portfolio is some attempt or some strategy for organizing the disorganized, organizing the diffuse. The second is state capacity, right? The second theory is the reason why we can't build lots of things we need is that in many cases, that's because we've sort of taken the brain out of government. We've systematically starved it. We've regulated the public sector such that it's impossible for it to do creative, dynamic things. So Molly had to read Bureaucracy with me, and at the very end of James Q. Wilson's Bureaucracy, he says, look, I've shown you all these problems with bureaucracy, and he says all those problems with bureaucracy is because we wanted it. Right? We regulated bureaucracy. We created constraints on hiring and firing. We've created constraints on the ability to pay for high-skilled civil servants. We've created rules after rules after rules so that bureaucracy is now entirely risk-averse, right? We could do otherwise. That's essentially how Wilson ends bureaucracy. He said, look, we could deregulate the public sector, right? We could give it more trust. We could give it more accountability in exchange for rules. And almost everybody in abundance says that we need to fundamentally fix the structures for public decision-making in order to have government actually deliver public value in an expeditious way. And the reason we don't, in part, is it goes back to the other side, is that many concentrated interests want it that way, right? They want government tied up in knots because mostly they care about protecting what they have as opposed to getting something they don't, right? They're fine with the status quo, but if you actually want government to build public transit and to clear the way for building more housing and fix healthcare and solve a lot of those problems, the only way to do that is actually to build governments that are more competent and more capable of doing big things. Okay. Everybody in the abundance spectrum agrees with that. But there is not just one kind of abundance, right? Because how people answer those questions of how you, where you get countervailing power, what people want more of, right? And what they think you need to do with the state all differ, right? So one of the arguments of this piece is there's a lot of space inside of this umbrella for people with very different kinds of projects, and that's inherent in the kind of idea that this is. Okay, so first of all, so one thing I'll have to tell you just a story about doing this paper. So for the first time, we decided that we wanted to actually make this a graphics-rich paper because, kids today, that was basically the explanation. Kids today, they want pictures. That's what they tell me. But one thing we were trying to do was to give people the ability to sort of visualize what it's like to be in each of these kind of ideological categories. So the first one is, and then these go roughly from the left to right, although I'm uncomfortable with the left and right, but for these, okay, so this is what we called red plenty, right? So this is supposed to have at least slight Soviet overtones, right? Worker and scientist creating plenty for people, right? That's the sort of the image of this. You'll see what we've sort of snuck nuclear power into all of these, right? Not very subtly. That's the esoteric, for Russ, that's the esoteric meaning here. That's the thing, is there, right?
I like to have that pointed out.
Thank you, that's right. So red plenty is essentially syncretic with the left, right? These are people who hearken back in some ways to an older left project, right? The project of, say, the TVA, right? Or French.
I don't know what the TVA is.
Oh yeah, sorry. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a big project in the New Deal to bring electricity to lots of southern states through dams and other kind of things, right? But also French nuclear policy in the 1970s, when now France has 70% of its power comes from nuclear power. That was not that was not a spontaneous project of the invisible hand. That was a big state project in which they just repeatedly built the same thing over and over again, and it turns out it's awesome, right? Or at least people like this believe that it's awesome. And their theory is the way that you're going to do that, right, is, again, you're going to have workers, right? So that's why we have this guy here. He's workers, he's labor, right? Is we're going to have organized labor and experts working together technocratically to build housing and energy and all the things, right? But the thing they want to do is they want to unleash the public sector, right? This is a project of state activity. And their argument, again, I always say is you can't build full communism with the National Environmental Protection Act, right? That is, all the procedures that we created in the 1970s around the environment, around planning, around all those things, actually end up hamstringing the ability to do big things in the public sector, right? And so that's the first thing. And so if you think about who the avatar for this is, it might be the next mayor of New York, right, I think is trying to run as a red plenty candidate, right? He's saying he wants to unleash the building of housing, right? He wants to build a lot of public supermarkets. That may or may not work, but part of the thing, again, he's been very clear, and he actually did an interview with Derek Thompson, one of the interviews of Abundance, where he threw a lot of love onto the book, and he said, look, I know that to do all the big things I want to do in the public sector, we can't do that with a public sector that looks the way it does today, right? And essentially what they want to do right now, unions mainly get into projects by saying, nobody's building anything unless they cut a deal with us, right? These guys are trying to invert it. They're trying to say, look, we're never going to get any jobs unless we're building lots of stuff, right? So in essence, it's a kind of producerist leftism, right? So that's the first. Okay, let's keep going. Here's the prettiest one. Everyone likes this. The one thing I'll say about this one is you can very faintly in the background see where the nuclear power plant is. It was closer, and then my wife said it was scary, so we put it further back. She was like, people are going to get scared by having the nuclear power plant like right next to the building. And so essentially, again, obviously, Cascadian abundance is syncretic with environmentalism, right? It's Cascadian because that's where we think of the region where these kind of instincts are the strongest. But this is different than what we might think of as at least the environmentalism we got used to since the 1970s for a couple of reasons, right? One is they clearly want to build something, right? A lot of the environmentalism in the 1970s was about creating multiple different opportunities for obstruction. That's all of the National Environmental Protection Act was saying. You had to have environmental review and oversight and rules and whatever. And these people are obsessed with the urgent need to build because they think the earth is about to go up into a flaming ball of death. Right? They worry about climate change, and they say the only way to avert climate change is to build our way out of it, right? We need to build lots of dense housing in cities, we need a lot of clean energy, we need a lot of public transportation, and we need it immediately. We need it right now, right? Which in essence has turned them against, first of all, the kind of pastoralism of traditional environmentalism, the preference for unspoiled nature, right? Because they're saying the only way to get unspoiled nature is also to have urbanism, right? That cities are in fact the cleanest form of ways to live, right? There's nothing more energy wasting than a single family house, right? And so, again, these guys all have a sense of urgency and a belief that actually you need to tear up an enormous amount of the procedural environmentalism of the previous era. And again, a lot of that is downstream, sorry, Doug, from industrial policy, because they believe that markets just on their own won't do it. But unlike the Red Plenty, these guys are kind of sector neutral, right? They're like, whoever can do it, whoever can build the houses, whoever can build the nuclear power plants, we're all for. Next, okay, so this is the Ezra and Derek one. So the people who write abundance, this is the one that's like them. This is what I call liberal abundance. Originally, I called it Cal abundance, but then Ezra got mad at me and said I was turning him into a regional thinker. But I do think this species of abundance is very much driven by the trauma of people who really believe in California, right? Who have a kind of romantic idea of what California was supposed to represent. It was supposed to represent kind of liberal values. It was supposed to represent being open and being dynamic and being forward-looking and being the place that people look to the future for. And then they said, when you actually look at the reality of California, the reality of California is calcification. The reality of California is that you can't build any housing. The reality of California is a stranded high-speed rail in the middle of the Central Valley, right? The reality of that is that the schools in California are no longer that all these things, that nothing works, right? Increasingly, nothing works in California. And these are, again, are people who are basically liberals. And the people who are the most like this are YIMBYs. YIMBY starts in California, right? It starts in California as a critique of what California has become. It starts out in housing, but then it grows into other things. It grows into energy. It grows into economic growth. It grows into opportunity, right? And so when you look at this, right, so I'll say when we did these originally, whenever you have to do these AI graphics just to warn people, you have to go back over and over again because they keep sending you the wrong thing. So going back to the Red Plenty for 1 second, when they originally gave me this, they gave me a thing that looked like it was on the surface of Mars. And I was like, that might be the reality, what's going to happen. That's what Doug Irwin would believe that would be, is if you try this, it'll look like the surface of Mars or look like a post-apocalyptic nightmare. But that's not what they think. And I'm trying to have what these people think they're going to do. This one originally was just creepy in ways that I probably shouldn't even talk about. And this one, they hadn't actually had all the building, right? So these guys' vision is that California is suddenly going to get its energy back. It's going to get the ability to actually start getting rid of the blocking coalitions. It's going to be the place people look to as the aspiration, both of creativity in the public sector in the way that the university, like the University of California was stood up in this incredibly rapid way. That California did all these remarkable things in the public sector, and they created, the most dynamic sector for new firms in the history of the world, not just in data, but in lots of other things, and that's the world they want to get to. Okay, so this one is maybe a little harder to see. This is what I call the moderate abundance synthesis, and the joke here is, I don't know if anyone saw, does anyone know who Senator Ruben Gallego is? Senator Gallego had a famous interview where he was talking about like what do Hispanic men in Arizona want, and his line was, "What they want is a big ass truck." Right. So that's the reason there's a big ass truck here, except it's electric. Right. You'll see it's a plug-in electric big ass truck. Right. You can also see there's a police uniform there. That's not by accident. And this is in the suburbs, but you can see here there's kind of gentle density, right? There's this ADU here where his grandma is probably gonna live, right? So he's gradually moving the suburbs up to a little more density, but he's looking out in the city. He's good. He's not against the city here. But the idea here is that abundance only works. The ability to build more, to actually get a political economy that's no longer zero sum, only works if you also have a politics that's socially moderate, right? That's moderate on public order issues like crime, that's not constantly telling people that they have to shrink and want less, right? This vision says it's okay that this guy wants his big ass truck so long as he can plug it in. Okay, going to the right. Now we're on the right. Now we're in the, I think I can say fairly, this is the Doug Irwin variety of abundance. This is called abundance.
Say about me is unfair.
No, this is totally true. No, this one's totally true. You will see yourself in what I'm about to say, Doug. So originally, when they sent us the AI graphics for this, it looked too Randian. It looked like a vision where there were like three, brilliant men who were creating great things for like all these mediocre people to go and consume. And I asked Virginia Postrel, the author of The Future and Its Enemies, about that. And she said, yeah, we need more of the vision of like tinkering, right? That actually dynamism and abundance comes from widespread innovation, right? It comes from lots of people doing things, from releasing the energies of a wide range of people. And unlike the people further to the left on my spectrum, these people aren't exactly sure exactly what we should be building. Right? This is, again, part of the more open-ended nature of a more libertarian. So this is syncretic with libertarianism, right? And it's, on the one hand, saying we could be building all kinds of things, some of which we haven't even imagined, whereas almost everybody to the left has a pretty good idea of what it is they want to build, right? They have a pretty good idea of what it is they want the future to look like, whereas these guys have a more open-ended idea of discovery. That's very Hayekian, right? That, we're going to discover what we want in the process of innovating, and therefore that's why markets are so much more central to this. But these guys have also recognized, and this is the abundance part, that you need an effective state to have effective markets, right? That you actually need, so Tyler Cowen is, I think, very much in this category. He had a famous essay called State Capacity Libertarianism that was saying that if you look at the countries that actually have the most dynamic markets, that have the freest markets, it's not an accident that they often have very effective, non-corrupt government that's capable of doing some of the most important things that markets need in order to work. And so in this vision, again, where abundance comes from is some combination of widespread innovation, widespread, including the innovation that comes from consumers, right? So there's a great book by Amar Bide called The Venturesome Economy that talks about the idea of sort of creative consumption, right? That abundance actually comes from the interaction of people who are producing things and people who are creatively consuming them and using them, and that leads to different waves of innovation. Okay, the final of these, this is the scary one. This is dark abundance. These guys, again, we think about all of these as syncretic with something else. The previous one was sort of syncretic with libertarianism. And this one, you could argue, is syncretic with maybe the tech right? Or with MAGA. And so I thought I wasn't going to tell this joke, but now I'm going to tell this joke anyways and just risk it. So when you do these AI things again, they give you something and you have to go back. And one of the principles on this part of the right is pronatalism, right? The belief that, we just need more babies, more kids, right? And that part of the reason that we want to actually make everything cheaper is then it'll be easier for people to have more children because children are great. These people may not have been woken up by a kid at 3 a.m. But when I originally did this, they only gave me one kid. AI only spit out one kid. And I was like, no, you need to give me more kids. It used to be like 3 or 4 kids. So then to get the 3 or 4 kids, originally it took the wife out. And I was like, given the guys who are behind this, you need at least 1 wife. So these guys believe very strongly in a weird kind of synthesis of techno-futurism and social conservatism, right? That the reason they want to build more, the reason they want to go to Mars, right, is in part in order to go back to the future, right? That's what you could say this is a little bit of the Back to the Future kind of version. These people also believe that most of our legacy institutions are the things that's standing in the way, right? So sorry, Dartmouth, right? These people think all of those institutions from our earlier era, right? Not both government and nonprofits and universities, and all of them are not going to be able to actually produce the kind of dramatic innovation in things like artificial intelligence and all these other areas that we need in order to get to the future. And so these guys are the institutional, we talked about creative destruction in the class before. These guys believe in creative destruction, not just in the market, but in everything, right? They think basically almost all of our institutions, and they are very optimistic about it, that AI is actually going to be able to replace a lot of those legacy institutions, including the institutions that produce knowledge. So where does this go in the future? Well, one thing I would say about this, and this is the last couple things I'll say, is why have all of these things in one movement, right? Why pluralism? And I think of abundance as fundamentally a pluralist movement. Right? It's saying in a time in which all of our politics is organized around organized conflict between polarized alternatives, we actually are experimenting with creating a movement that contains all of that diversity, everything from red plenty over to dark abundance, right? And why is that good? Well, one, I think it's good because competition and conflict are good, right? It's good to learn from people, right? That's how we learn, is that we don't just stay in our own silos, but we get out of it and we actually, both have a kind of common project and we have conflict about how to achieve it, right? I think it reduces the probability of groupthink and tribalism to try and create movements that in a way incorporate really deep pluralism, really deep difference, right? And it also increases the points of influence in a world in which we don't know who's going to be in charge, right? That's one of the things about contemporary politics, is nobody really quite knows who's going to be running things in the future. And if we only have a movement that's optimized for one point on the ideological or partisan spectrum, then we're not going to succeed. I also think we in the abundance movement can model for people what it's like to get out of the trap we're in, right? What it's like to get out of the effective polarization kind of thing that we're in, where our arguments are about how to solve problems, right? It's not that these differences between the red plenty people and the dark abundance and the abundance dynamist people are going to be reconciled, right? But by doing it together, we're going to model essentially what is constitutional American practice, which is that in general, we shouldn't be trying to solve problems only by getting one party that monopolizes all the power and does everything. That's not what our founders thought was the way to run a republic. Our founders thought that the way to run a republic was that we had to govern together through and around difference. So I think of abundance fundamentally as a democracy movement, as the most important democracy movement, because throughout the world, authoritarians are saying that only authoritarianism can solve problems, right? That democracy is effectively bankrupt as a problem-solving enterprise, right? And therefore, we need to centralize power in the hands of strong men, right? And I think for democracies to survive, it has to prove it can deliver. It has to prove it can actually make the things that people want, that it actually is a better way to solve problems, not on every one of them, right? But over time, its ability to process information, to learn from many minds, to get actually generative conflict will work better than authoritarianism, right? And I believe, again, that it's a democratic movement for the last thing because it has defined the problem as the capture of our political system by mobilized minorities, as opposed to the interests of the broad majority who, for the most part, have not been organized into politics as we have organized it before. And so on that note, I will take your questions and attacks on my parentage and anything else you might want to talk about. Oh, you gotta get the mic up there. Also, I'm on my fourth lecture or talk today, so if my voice gives in.
Oh, no excuses.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to get your sympathy. I'm like, yeah, that's the equivalent of going, not in the face. Not in the face. All right, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. I'm Catherine at 28 in Professor Clark's Growth and Its Critics class. I'm wondering how, especially since abundance is such a democratic norm sense focused movement, why you think that techno-futurists would be a part of the movement, especially because of how Peter Thiel and other techno-futurists or accelerationists are very clearly anti-democratic norms and pro more authoritarianism.
Okay, you mean big D, not little d, right? Like Democratic Party, Democrat. Okay. Okay, let me see how I want to answer this. So I believe, to go back, wrong way. Yeah, to our friends in dark abundance, right? One, I believe. Now, Peter Thiel is a edge case, just to be clear, right? I thought of creating a category to the right of these guys and then decided that I wanted to do the ones that I think were fundamentally democratic, right? So I think these guys do believe that they, in fact, are the most democratic category, right? They think that the centers of professional knowledge, right, are effectively centers of power, right? That universities, right? They don't believe their pretense of neutrality and disinterestedness, right? They think that they're kind of monopoly centers of information generation, and that breaking them up and creating more competition, creating more centers for expertise is in fact democratic. They think that the bureaucratic power in the administrative state is in fact anti-democratic, right? That it tends to empower people with a certain kind of set of expertise or knowledge or relationships. And so they think that the only way to actually get to democracy is to allow for democratic majorities to make decisions about often power that's been embedded down into civil society institutions. It's sort of hiding down in there, but it's real power, right? And that way, it's not that different than some versions of the left that say, look, the lot of feminism says, look, the family is a center of power, right? And that we ought to be able to use public authority to do something about inequality that's there. If that's democratic, these guys would argue, so is this, right? And so in that sense, I don't think these guys believe that they're anti-democratic. They actually think that sort of entrenched professional and expert power is in fact the most anti-democratic thing that sort of pretends to democracy or pretends to majoritarianism. Who's next? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and tell me who you are. Now they're doing this because this is all being recorded and sent into AI, into intelligence services or whatever. I don't know what they do with that.
Excellent. Every professor's goal is to get put on a list somewhere. So I'm Kieran Sankar, I'm a postdoc here. So one of my favorite actually policy manifestations of abundance was NASA's Commercial Orbital Transportation Services program. So from about 2006 to 2014, NASA basically ran a competition to see whether private companies could transport things into space. And this is why SpaceX is a thing. Right. And also why Elon Musk is rich, so plus minus. And in the docs of that program, you find a bunch of language saying that government should act like a venture capitalist, right? And there's this worry that I sort of have, which is, while I'm a big fan of market making in general, right, of the government buying things in an effort to make product markets that weren't there before. One thing that venture capitalists do is take equity stakes in firms, right? And if the government does that, that seems like a ready-made way to get you another like little vetocratic power base, right? That like stymies innovation. And so there's this question about like, is there a principled way to think about state capacity in the context of innovation that doesn't just lead you automatically to this sort of recreating of the vetocracy all over again?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and I thought about that a lot in the context of the captured economy kind of project. The one thing is that competition is a thing that's created, just like markets are all right. Markets are artifices, right, that we create through law and norms and regulation, and we can create all those things to generate more competition or less, right? And so when I think of the problem of the fact that now we're entirely dependent on SpaceX to get stuff into space, right? One theory would be that we should be trying to sort of, tamp down on their power, and the other is we ought to be stepping on the gas with others, right? That that's why like all of the other space companies are that's so important to get all of them, because it would be a tragedy if we were entirely dependent, especially on things with such enormous security implications. So I do think part of the state capacity side, just to go back to that of this project, right? Is the idea that, in lots of areas, obviously including national security, where there's actually been enormous innovation in who's providing things to the government. The government got very used to dealing with these very sleepy bureaucratic firms like Boeing, right, that turn out to lead to cost overruns and taking forever and are not very innovative. Government, through the sort of Unit X in the Defense Department, really made an active effort to try and to nurture a new ecosystem of firms that would be way more competitive. And I think that's a good example of trying to get around this problem of state-created monopoly, right? When in many cases the state can make choices about whether it wants to actively induce the creation of new market entrants. Obviously, it's easiest to do that when it's the purchaser, but there may be other areas where, rather than thinking about competition as just something you do through antitrust, right? There's lots of other things government can do to actually crowd new firms into industries that are uncompetitive. Oh, we're good. Oh yeah, and tell me who you are.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a 27. I'm also in Professor Clark's class. I was just wondering, like, at least from what I understand now, the spectrum of people promoting these abundance agendas are very, varied in the sense that, I assume that if dark abundance kind of won and got AI to replace all these legacy institutions, then the red plenty abundance people would be very upset. And, so what exactly are they working together towards?
So, one thing I think is sort of interesting is one of the most important publications that everybody here ought to be reading is Works in Progress, which is also a beautiful publication. Like, people don't make beautiful things anymore, so just to be upright because they actually went and tried to make something pretty. But and they're more or less in this abundance dynamism category, but recently, and most of those guys had been libertarians, had worked in libertarian think tanks, and they published one of my favorite essays of the last 10 years called Liberté, Égalité, Radioactivité, which is basically about France's project of building nuclear power in the 1970s, and they were essentially saying, if we want, all these AI data centers that are so incredibly energy hungry, the energy for that is not going to come spontaneously. It's not going to come out of spontaneous market activity. That we actually need something closer to this, right, to get that scale of new clean energy online. And so I do think when you actually look at how these guys work together, there again, in some of the things they want are very different, right? But in some of them, again, I think especially where energy is concerned, there are weird, strange bedfellows coalitions. And the other thing to say is, all of these varieties are all basically pro-growth, right? So now again, in most of actual America, ideologically, that's not controversial. On campuses, the degrowth sort of virus has gotten out, but most people don't have a first principled opposition to growth in principle, but in practice, right? A lot of people's practice is anti-growth, right? That they're like, oh, of course we want growth, but not in my town, not the nuclear power plant down here, not the new, not getting rid of these old legacy institutions, not when it's my legacy institution. So I think part of what's interesting about this is both the things that they agree on, right? I think a lot of things around law, there's agreement, right? That our basic systems for getting public input are broken, right? That we're all justified in the name of democracy, but have now all essentially been captured by small, narrow, minoritarian interests. That's a kind of language that almost all these people have. Now, again, that manifests in different ways, right? So again, the people on the left have a vision of, majoritarian democracy that is going to overcome all these interests, including market interests, right? But they don't think that the ways that the left has often said that we need to have public participation and representation in everything is the way to actually get people all the things that they need. So I think one of the interesting things about the abundance movement is both where people differ, but also these weird, strange bedfellows coalitions they make along this other dimension that's separate from their left-right dimension.
Hi, my name is Darcy. I'm from Bethesda, Maryland. I'm 28.
Montgomery County for the win.
Yeah. So I thought the theory was very interesting, but I'm really curious to understand the practical implications of a movement that covers this many different political ideologies. You mentioned, sort of protests about housing shortages, but what other practical steps is this movement looking at in terms of actually creating change in a government that is very majoritarian and polarized?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that this would be a good thing for a future PhD student to study in political science, right? We know remarkably little about nonpartisan policymaking, right? I mean, there's a little bit of literature in political science on this, but Matt Iglesias has talked about what he calls sort of secret Congress policymaking, that even while we have this extraordinary effective polarization, somehow, there are still these weird coalitions getting made, often, again, on things that are off the left-right dimension, right? So if you think about the, Senators Warren and Scott, right, very conservative, very left members, have this housing bill that has all these ideas on housing that have been, bumping around a whole range of these abundance kind of spectrum. Right? It's partially because these organizations are now capable of providing expertise and knowledge into that, but also they've sort of raised the salience of this off the left-right dimension issue, again, that just doesn't fit. Now, the problem is mostly the people who control agenda access in politics are the people who are on the left-right spectrum, right? So what we know about leaders of parties is they mostly only want Congress to legislate on the thing where their party is totally unified and the opposition is totally unified on the opposite side, right? But one secret I think we found is there's enormous appetite among policymakers of a very wide range of left-right things that they actually like doing the secret Congress legislating. And that's most of what abundance want, right? When you actually look at nuclear power, right? Nuclear power at one point was pretty polarized, is much less polarized now than it used to be. There's lots of environmentalists who now know that solar and wind are not going to get them to their, Cascadian future that they want, right? That they need a bigger nuclear power plant than that, actually. And that there's lots of weird, strange bedfellows coalitions to be made on that. There's all kind of weird coalitions to be made on the regulation of doctors, right? Which turn out to be enormously important for healthcare, right? And so one thing I'll say is I think there's appetite among politicians for doing things like that. I think there's appetite on campuses like this, that people are tired of just the politics of like about who said the word and what was that, and that kind of very linguistic politics, which also only engages a very particular kind of person, right? And so when I think about who the constituency for abundance is, especially on campuses, I always tell people, sorry for any sociology or political science majors, right? It's STEM majors, right? Because in our story, people like engineers are the heroes, right? They're not the heroes in any of the regular campus left-right politics, right? But the people who actually are coming up with big, innovative ways to solve problems through technology are the heroes of our story, right? And people like doing politics where they're the hero, right? They don't like doing politics where somebody else is telling them that they're the bad guy and they're the ones who brought all the bad stuff into the world, right? So I think there's also opportunities to engage people who mostly are not engaged into democratic politics now around problem solving. And I also think organizing people into groups that include this kind of range but also have this kind of common language is good democratic practice. It'd be good practice for Dartmouth students to do that and say, okay, when we actually have meetings, we're going to talk about what actually works, right? And so the question is, right, you know, if we want to build housing, if we want to build energy, if we want to reform healthcare, right, show me the receipts about what actually works. And I think that's part of the language of this movement, even though people have very different priors about what they think is going to work. Okay, we got time for one or two more questions. Uh-oh. He's got the killer one, I can tell.
No, it's not a killer question. In fact, I really appreciate that answer, and I just want to invite you to expand on it a little bit by asking you a version of the same question that you were just asked. The question might be something like this: Why, Steve, do we really need an abundance movement when we have the Republican Party? The Republican Party is for abundance. It's the Democratic Party that's for regulation. The Republican Party is for lowering barriers to doing business, such as lower taxes. It's the Democratic Party that doesn't like business. So we have a pro-business, pro-abundance party. Why do we need a movement?
Okay, so no, we don't have that party, right? So just to give you an example on housing, right? The absolute worst NIMBYs in the world are Republicans in New Jersey and Massachusetts and northeastern cities, right? The absolute worst, right? You might say, well, in the abstract, their ideology says, right? But if you want to find people who will lay down on the tracks to avoid anybody ever building any more in their beautiful little town, right? That's northeastern Republicans, right? So one thing is that Republican Party might exist among certain faculty members in this room, right? That is not the actually existing Republican Party, right? On lots of things, right? And actually, and this is again the difference in some cases between being a pro-business party and being a pro-market party, being a pro-dynamism party, right? In lots of cases, right? Again, if you think about even the fossil fuel industry, or the fossil fuel industry now is thrilled with anything that's going to hamper competition from clean energy, right? They're working in the Republican Party to do that. They're pulling out completely done offshore wind projects, right? Just in order to preserve the coal industry in some cases, right? So in that sense, I don't think, at least the Republican Party as it exists now in the real world, not in the world of, a few market-oriented professor types, right? That's not what the Republican Party is. Also, I don't think I think most people here have said, that the lever of using taxes in order to create dynamism there's pretty much no more juice in that, right? When you're actually trying to look at, why do we not have really great growth? Just to go to housing, because it's the one I know the most, right? I've been working on this project on why is it we build so little housing in factories in the United States, right? And that's a problem because that's the only way anyone's figured out how to create efficiency in anything, right? If we were still having to build like bicycles all like on site, if you wanted to bike, somebody had to go and put it together all in one place, build only one and then move on to another, right? Our bicycles would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But we built factories. We built them all over the world. So now we have international trade. I have to get the international trade in there for that, right? Which is also great, right? But that's a big problem that's not about tax rates, right? It's about something much more complicated about legacy systems and transitions from one mode of production to another. And I think of the abundance would really be saying our problems are through like dozens of problems like that, of deeply embedded production, regulatory, government systems that we need to actually dig into. And that also creates lots of opportunities with people with different kind of skills, with different kind of knowledge to work together, often on solutions that don't just fit into the standard left-right distribution. Can we take more? That's it? They gotta let them go. All right.
But people can come up and ask you questions.
Okay.
I want to thank you for sharing with
Thank
us
you.
your enthusiasm about this movement, telling us about the abundance movement, and tuning us into it. It's really actually exciting to learn about.
Thank you.
And you were there first, I gotta say, in some sense. So it is an honor to have you back up here at Dartmouth.
Always happy to do
And
that.
we really appreciate you letting us work your heart all day long. So if you have thoughts or questions, come on up.
Yeah.
And thank you very much.